if you would, open back with me to the book of Exodus. We're going to bring to a conclusion. I don't want to really call it a Mother's Day message, but that's what it started out last Sunday. But I just felt led that we should conclude this and look at what this family is telling us. I thought about as revival was mentioned. Revival has got to start as much in the home as it has in the church. And as soon as the family gets in position for God to bless and use, then I think we'll begin to see things turn around. Now, I don't believe that there's any wrong time to address the needs of our families. And most of the time we just confine that to Mother's Day and Father's Day. But I think that we should feel that the need to address our families and the problems and the difficulties that they encounter at any time, because those problems are very real. And families are facing some of the most difficult and trying situations today that we have ever faced as a family. And I thank God that He used ordinary people to share His message. There's nowhere in the Bible that there's a perfect family. It started out that way, but quickly changed. God used everyday people to share His word. And so it is as we think about the scripture that we're going to read today. We're going to bring this to a conclusion. Lessons learned from a mother of faith. And that's exactly what this is. Or we should say from a family of faith. We find in Exodus chapter 2, beginning with verse 1, we find the story of their names are not mentioned in this particular scripture, but we know who they are. The husband was a man by the name of Amram. The wife was Jochebed. They had 3 children, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, who was the younger. None of them were perfect in any stretch of the imagination. And yet God used them in a very special way to get across to families in our generation. Because we find ourselves faced with some of the same situations, some of the same scenarios that Moses' family was faced with. They were faced with questions they didn't really have answers for, and situations that they didn't have solutions for. And so they just depended on God to work them through it. And I think that is where the family needs to be today. We're listening too much to what the world has to say. We're ordering our families by the demands of society and of the government. But I think as we get into this, and we'll bring it to a conclusion today, that we see how we can deal and how we can handle various situations in our life. Exodus chapter 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. Now this does not mean that Amram married his sister. They were of the same lineage. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and dabbed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid him in the flags of the river's bank. And his sister stood, this is Miriam, stood afar off to know, to wit, to understand what was to be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. And he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now, as we began looking at this last week, I think some of the most powerful, influential people in the world are not the rich and famous. They're not the wealthy. They're not the powerful. They're not the politicians. But it's everyday men and women, husbands and wives, that raised their family in accordance to God's will and what God would want to accomplish through them. Now, one thing that I saw about this situation with Moses, with Jochebed and Amram, is that Jochebed was by herself. Now, where Amram was, there's a lot of different speculations that he was out working in the mines, or he was making brick, and he was just slaving away for the government of Egypt. And Amram was left at home, and she had to call most of the shots. Now, that pretty much hasn't changed too much, has it? Because women are still, I don't want to say the head of the house, that is supposed to be our position, but sometimes she calls the shots, and sometimes she makes the decisions. And as I thought about Jochebed, as I thought about the position that she was placed into, I can understand how God used this woman the way that he used her, and the faith that she demonstrated in the life of her family. Now, as we began looking at this, there were three things that I wanted us to see. We only got through the first one, of how her faith played out in the life of her family, and what her faith was able to accomplish in the lives of her children, and how God used them up in later years to be the instruments that he needed at a particular moment. It was Miriam, after they had crossed the Red Sea, after they had crossed over out of Egypt, out of bondage. It was Miriam that led the women in a song of celebration. Aaron later became the order of the priesthood. And Moses, of course, became the leader of the nation of Israel. Now, one thing that stands out about all of these is none of them were perfect. None of them. Moses made some mistakes later in his life. So did Miriam, and so did Aaron. It was Aaron that made the golden calf. But how God used them, and how God used their work to bring about for his people what he was wanting to accomplish. Now, we understand that our families today are facing some rather difficult situations. Nothing is like it was when we grew up. Everything has changed. Our family, the environment in which most of the children are raised, is completely different from what it was. And I shared with you a story last week of an actor by the name of Kirk Cameron, who is a devout Christian, and how he relayed a story when speaking recently at the Billy Graham Library, that he was talking about the extreme wicked forces that are targeting our children today. And he said their main goal, their main purpose, was the complete collapse of the family. And I think we're seeing that. And they're going not through the adults as much as they are through the children. Now let me share one other thing with you that I read just this past week. That there is a bill currently on the desk of the governor of the state of Washington. And if he signs this bill and it becomes law, it would allow homeless shelters and homes for youth to hide runaway children from their parents, especially if their parents refuse to help their children obtain a gender-based medical intervention. According to the bill, all that would be required is for the child to claim that their parents do not support their intent to take cross-sex hormones or to have sex change operation. It goes on to state that increasingly the fact that parental rights are seen by the government, by school boards and state officials as being the greatest threat and the biggest harm to their children's rights. God help us. God help us. If we as parents and grandparents allow this to continue. And I hope that somehow, and I know the state of Washington is real liberal, and it would not surprise me that this is not signed into law. And they have the right then to take your children, to hide your children. You all right, Larry? Okay. Kind of scared me there for a minute. But they would have the right to do that. And they're saying that your right as a parent doesn't amount to anything. That your right as a grandparent does not have any impact on your children. So we see the first area of Jochebed's faith for her family, that her faith was trusted God when there was a time of great crisis. They were in a difficult situation. They were in a time that they had never experienced before. How long they had been, some estimate that by now that the nation of Israel had been captive for around 300 years, maybe a little more, in the land of Egypt. But yet they were treated decently. They were not abused. They accepted them as the descendants of Joseph. And we know where Joseph played out in the Pharaoh's court, and he was given the position, and he was given this responsibility of overseeing his work. And so times changed. We don't know how much time there was, but in chapter 1, verses 8 through verse 10, it says, there arose another king that did not recognize Joseph, that did not know him, and he began to treat the children of Israel very cruel. And he began to place upon them burdens that were not possible for them to bear. Now, we have seen in our nation things escalate to a crisis, I would say. We have watched politicians that they have caved in to the demands of this world and to our society. I was reading just last week of the school board, I think it was in Dorchester County, that they had made a decision that they would remove the child-based books that are sexual content out of the library. And then they were put under pressure, and they went back on that decision and were going to leave them for children first grade up to be able to look at those books, transgender, homosexual, and all of this. And no one has raised a voice or against the decision of the school board. They've all gone along with it. And yet this is the group that sees your responsibility as a parent, as a grandparent, and mine, as being something that is being unjustly put on our children. Now, all you have to do is go back and read the Bible, and you will see the responsibility that God has placed upon parent and grandparent. Look into the book of Timothy, his mother and his grandmother, and the impact that they had in his life and how they formed him. That would simply not be allowed in our day. That would simply not float. Our government would rise up against it. And we have one of the most wicked governments that I think that we have seen in a long, long time, that are bent against destroying, in my opinion, the family and the home. They're bent on doing away with religion. They want everybody to worship the same God, and that's just not going to happen. The second thing that I saw about her faith, about Jochebed's faith, is not only how it trusted God in a time of crisis. Now, folks, we need to take this to heart. We're in a crisis mode in our families. We are seeing things taught in schools that we never imagined would ever be taught in a public school. We're having to put up with things that are so much against the way we came up, simply because some politician or some government agency says this is the way we need to go. There was a crisis in the family of Jochebed, but she never gave in. She never gave up. And I thank God that we can read about this mother. We can read about this woman and how her faith had an impact upon her family and how it determined their outcome. You know, as you think about Moses, 3 months old, as you think about Miriam, who was probably around 10, maybe 12 years old, as you think about Aaron, who was probably around 3 years old, and how faith impacted every one of these children and how it made a difference in their life. Here was a mother who would not give in to the demands of the Egyptian government. The Egyptian government said every male child was to be destroyed, was to be killed. He was to be cast into the Nile River. But here was a mother who defied that order, who hid her child, who protected him at all costs. I wonder how many mothers would stand in the gap today. How many mothers would take the stand that Jochebed took and said, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to see my children through. And I want them to accomplish what God has purposed in their life. It was in a time of great crisis. Now, folks, if we can look at the family and we can determine there's no crisis, then something's wrong. That everything's okay, everything's all right. Do you realize that the majority of young people that are getting married today or raising a family today do not even recognize church as being important? They do not recognize God as being significant in their life. They do not see religion as being important. They depend more on the government to meet their needs than they do God. But yet here was a mother who was willing to go the course. Here was a woman at all costs was going to protect her family. I would to God that we would see mothers rise up in this country today that would take the stand that she took. The second thing about her faith and how it interacted with her family and how it impacted her family was that she trusted God when things seemed out of her control. If you go back and read verses 3 through verse 9, there's a whole list of things that Jochebed had no control over. There were things that were simply beyond her ability to solve. There were things as a woman in this generation that she was not qualified, according to the government, to speak on behalf of her family. And yet we see how she dealt with this situation. And how many times have we, as parents, as grandparents, how many times have we seemed to be so helpless in solving the problems that our children and grandchildren are dealing with today? How do we answer the questions that are being asked about transgender, about homosexual, about what is being taught in a number of schools today about it's okay if you are a boy and you want to be a girl. It's okay. How do we answer that as parents and grandparents? How do we deal with it? Now, that wasn't the particular problem that Jochebed was faced with, but it was a situation. There were situations that were coming up that seemed to be out of her control. The government, the educational system, and society as a whole were reducing parental authority for the well-being of the child. Are we not seeing that today? Are we not seeing the government step in and tell parents what they can do and what they cannot do in raising their children? Things were out of her control. Now, we're not told exactly what happened. She had successfully hidden Moses for 3 months. But somehow, some way, something went wrong. And she seemed to be losing control of the situation. Perhaps some neighbor heard a child cry, and they informed authorities. Perhaps a neighbor told on her. You know, she's got a male child. I cast mine in the river. I allowed you to do, but she's raising hers. And she had to deal with that situation. The authorities were on their way. In any event, whatever happened, it appeared that Jochebed was in the midst of a crisis. She was looking at a situation that was totally out of her control. How do we, as parents, as grandparents, how do we confront the government about our children and grandchildren? How do we go to the school boards and confront them about what's being taught our children? How do we confront society as a whole and say what you believe and what you're trying to get my child and grandchild to believe is wrong? How do we do that? And yet that was the situation that Jochebed suddenly found herself. Everything was fine for 3 or 4 months until Moses got to the point that she could no longer hide him. And she had to deal with it. The situation was getting out of hand. And I think we have seen that over and over again in the last 35 to 40 years in this nation. We are seeing things, I am, that I never imagined that I would ever see take place in a Christian nation. In one nation under God, that we are allowing this to happen. Here was a mother that stood her ground. She was not going to allow the government. She was not going to allow society. She was not going to allow anyone to take control of her children. She had turned them over to God, and she was trusting Him to take care of them. Now, folks, when things seem to be out of our control, when things seem to be beyond us, they're not beyond God. They're not out of His control. You know, I've tried to picture Jochebed. I tried to envision what this mother was going through. Apparently, Amram was away from home. How long? We don't know. Where he was? We don't know. And she was faced to deal with this by herself, basically. I can almost see her frantically preparing this basket that she was going to place her baby in and put him in the Nile River. I can almost hear her beginning to cry and pray and ask God for help and direction. And yet I wonder how long it's been since we, as parents and grandparents, have prayed for our children and grandchildren. Do we lift them up to God? Do we ask God to watch over them and care for them? Because I have a grandson that's in college. And college ain't what it used to be. Now, you can rest assured of that. And they're faced with things that we never imagined that we would ever see. How do we deal with it? It seems to be beyond our control. I can't go to Winthrop College and demand that they show me their schedule, that you show me what you're teaching my grandson. I can't do that without running the risk of being arrested. But I can pray. And I can lift him up to God. And I can ask God to keep His hand upon him, to make the right decisions and the right choices, for him to live a life that honors God. Folks, we have let our families down. When we fail to pray for them, when we fail to lift them up to God, when we fail to entrust them into His care. Things were beyond Jochebed. She didn't know what to do. And the only person she could turn to was God. Well, maybe that's what God's trying to wake us up to. When things seem to be out of our control, when I don't have the answers, when I can't solve the problems, there's always one that is able, and that's God. Here was a mother who went against the odds of her day, who stood her ground and would not cave in to the government, to the educators, to society as a whole. And she stood her ground for her children. As I think about Jochebed and what she was going through, as I think about what she was up against. A woman that was in a society that was a man's world, not a woman's. And yet how she stood and turned her family over to God. Folks, I'm telling you, if you want to see revival in this country, it's got to start at the home. I truly believe that. It's got to start with mamas and daddies waking up to the fact that we are confronted with situations and circumstances that are beyond us. How do we stand against the government? How do we stand against society as a whole? How do we make our plea to an educational system that is all secular? You know, most of you that came up when I did, we started every school day with a devotional, with a prayer, with a Bible reading. Now Bibles have been taken out of schools. Prayer is not offered that much anymore, unless it's away from campus, excuse me. But that's the society in which we live. You know, if you look back in verses 4 through verse 9, or verse 3 through verse 9, you can just see God's hand all over this. In verse 4, here was little Miriam, keeping an eye out on baby brother. Here was little Miriam watching to see what would happen. In verse 5, when Jochebed put the basket in the water, she didn't throw it out into the middle of the river and let the current just take it away. She placed it where she knew that it would go into the bulrushes. It would be close to the bank. In verse 6, when Pharaoh's daughter came and got the basket and opened it, the Bible says the child wept. I like what one guy said, I was reading. He said the moment she took the lid off of that basket, God pinched Moses. And he began to cry. And she had compassion. She was moved at the tears of this little baby. And then in verses 7 and 8, Miriam asked Pharaoh's daughter, said, do you want me to go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse this child so you can take him into your house? She said, go, get one. Well, who did Miriam get? Went and got her mother, got Jochebed. And the thing of it is that Jochebed was paid out of the household of Pharaoh to tend to her baby. Now, we have no idea how old Moses was, how long she had kept him, but I'm sure that she kept him long enough that somehow God instilled in Moses the values and the principles of life itself. She taught him. She taught her child, her children, the most important things about life. We don't do that to our children today, do we? We teach them anything but that. And then the last thing I want to share with you very quickly is that her faith trusted God when it was time to let go. When it was time to let go. The Bible describes Jochebed's last act toward her son in the words of verse 10. And when the child grew, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. She didn't come up with that name. That was the name God had already given. He just allowed her to use it. one of the greatest harms that we do our children as parents and grandparents is we refuse to let them go. Here was a mother that turned her child over to God when the time came. Now, when you think about this situation, you think about now, Pharaoh had an idea. He had a plan. I'm going to train Moses. I'm going to bring him up, and he's going to be the prince of Egypt. Well, God had a plan too. God said all of this training, all of this teaching, all of this education that Moses would receive from Pharaoh was going to equip him to be the leader of God's people. Folks, we never lose anything when you place it in God's hands. She let him go. She turned him loose. But she was trusting God the whole time to take care of him. Parents, let me ask you something. Have you released your children, your grandchildren? Have you turned them over to God? She wasn't letting go of him. I don't know how long Jochebed lived after this. I don't know that after this situation she's mentioned again. But she had an impact on her family that lasted their entire lifetime. She let go and she turned them over to God. Parents and grandparents, I'm just simply asking, what kind of impact are we leaving on our children and grandchildren? Where are they? What have we done with what God has entrusted us? Here was a mother, a parent, who would not give up. When she was confronted with a great crisis, when she was confronted with things being beyond her control, when it was time for her to let go, she released him to God. I would that parents today, especially the younger generation, could come to the place in their life where they could give their children back to God. You know, I think about Hannah. Here was a woman that prayed for a number of years for God to give her a son. And she said, God, if you give me that son, I'll give him back to you. And she did just that. Have we done such? Things are not going to become better until the family becomes better, more equipped to deal with the situations that we face in life. Family, I challenge us. Where are our children? You remember the old commercial that used to come on back when TV would sign off at 12 o'clock? And they'd say, parents, do you know where your child is? Do we? Do we know where they are? Jochebed knew. And she watched those children grow and mature and develop in God. And he used every one of them. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. But God used them in a way that only he could use them. That's what he's challenging us today. Our Father, as we bow in your presence this morning, God, we're so grateful for the stories that we read of mothers and fathers who gave themselves and their life to you, their children to you. and said, I'm releasing them in your care. God, take them and use them as only you can. God, take them. Let them be a blessing, first of all, to you, and then to the world in which they live. Lord, I pray that every one of us as parents and grandparents would look at our faith and the impact that it has upon our children and grandchildren. What direction is it leading them? What kind of statement are we making? God, help us. Help us to bring our families up in a way that they would walk with you. Our children are never too young. They're never too old for us to pray over and ask your blessings upon them. When our children become sick, we request prayer for God's healing. What about their spiritual condition? Are we concerned about that as much as we are the physical? Lord, the family was the first institution that you brought into existence in the Garden of Eden. The family is what's going to make the difference. God, open our hearts and our lives, for we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.